Ninan, thank you so much for joining us here. I want to say congratulations because I don't know if everyone here knows, but you're new to Travel Leaders Group. You've just been with PR Newswire since 2009?
Since 2009. So first of all, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. But yes, I was in the travel industry until about 2007. 3 years with System One, 14 years with Sabre, on the GDS side, on the airline software side.
So why'd you come back?
So that's a great question. I think it was probably a mixture of a couple of things. I think my interest level in travel always remained high, even through my 6.5 years at PR Newswire. So emotionally, I think there was always that connection and tie, and I stayed involved, obviously, through a variety of different venues in the travel industry. And frankly, when it came time to figure out what the next opportunity was after PR Newswire, the choice for me was really being in your industry, the media business, or remaining in it, and coming back to travel. And aside from the emotional sort of tug of being back in travel, I also was quite familiar with the owners and investors and travel leaders and really the trajectory of the business and the opportunity to be part of something that had been so successful over the last number of years in growing a business to what it is today with 40,000 travel professionals and approximately 20 billion in air was hard to turn down. That's why I'm here.
Right. So, we're here today to talk about sort of evolving trends in leisure and business travel. So you sort of stepped away and now you're back. How have things changed? What are the big trends that people need to know about in how people are traveling, how consumers are booking travel, and how businesses are dealing with their travel?
So Andrew, I think in all things, there are some things that have seemed to have changed quite substantially and other things that really feel like they're largely almost as if I hadn't left in 2007. So I think this whole discussion of GDSs, where they stand intermediated in the travel business, the role of TMCs, largely seems to be the same discussion, but having evolved a little bit. I think the biggest fundamental change that I see in the landscape is really one of where we've got obviously a much, much wider range of tools, capabilities, technology, and really much more empowered consumers and travelers, highly educated about the travel landscape. But in some senses, I think that's, as we touched on earlier, a little bit of a microcosm of this broader change that seems to be taking place, really redefining relationships between employers and employees, virtual workspaces, rules, regulations, etc.
Right. So in terms of business travel, Travel Leaders Group is big in business travel, and there's so much data out there in terms of how people are traveling, how to keep them safe, and how companies can save money by dealing with the TMC and having the right partnerships. How do you build those relationships, and what are the things that you talk to clients about to sort of make sure that they understand what they're getting out of a relationship with you guys?
So I think our direct response to that, and then I'd love to sort of back up a little bit and look at the broader landscape. Our direct response, I think, to the market opportunity there has been to create a business unit called Financial Solutions that's really primarily in the business of analytics, visualization around travel spend. And we've got clients amongst them, US Steel, for example, where we don't do any corporate travel booking. We're not a TMC for US Steel. We primarily provide these analytical services. So that's sort of our direct response to really the space itself. I think at a broader level, and sort of hearkening back to the point I made earlier, clearly there's a level of tension, I guess is the best way to put it, between travelers and their desire to sort of seek these amazing sets of tools and capabilities that are available to them while still trying to comply with, I think, a corporation's perspective on policies, rules, obviously notification. And I do think that this whole relationship primarily pivots on a couple of things. In my mind, they're really around transparency and really roles and responsibilities. So I think as the nature of a corporation and its responsibility for employees changes. For example, if you're an at-home employee and you're in your own home and let's say you trip over some furniture, that's got a different aspect to it than doing so in the workplace, right? So I think as we go back to travel and we think about duty of care, to the degree employees, et cetera, wish to take more of that into account, and it's up to the corporation to define that, I think there needs to be a level of transparency around what's taking place, who's responsible and accountable for it, and actually a level of transparency and then that role redefinition around saying, well, if something goes wrong, who's supposed to do what in the equation. And I think both of those aspects, roles and responsibility, transparency, are fueled by data.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the debate that's worth having, and the discussion that's worth having is this redefinition of how all of that takes place. So we're not going to stop employees from using Uber if that's the most convenient thing that's around, or Airbnb. It again gets back to saying, if there's an issue or an incident, who's responsible, how do we step in, how do we intermediate ourselves and play the role the corporation wants us to play.
Yeah, I mean, how do you approach, rogue bookings and these sharing economy services that, while they could save you money, they're easier to book, the person might feel happier that they're doing it themselves. You open up, there's security issues, there's data security issues. Is there like an overarching policy that you guys have, or you approach it based on the policy of the individual?
So at the end of the day, Andrew, I think it is the responsibility of the corporation to define, I think, what their point of view and perspective is on responsibility and accountability for open bookings. I think the genie's out of the bottle. There's no possible way of putting it back in, and frankly, why would you? They actually make the travel experience better, broadly speaking. So I think our role as participants in this food chain, as obviously a provider of travel services, somebody who books on behalf of corporations, is to embrace the technology that's out there, make it part of the experience, but it does require that redefinition that we touched on earlier of saying the data and transparency has to be there to say, okay, so-and-so happened to use an Uber vehicle, and here's our role. We're still responsible for tracking the data. How do we get the data? How do we understand it from travel reporting purposes? But if something goes wrong, there needs to be a clear understanding and an expectation of who's actually solving the problem when the problem takes place. So I do think it is those two parts to it, roles and responsibilities. We're no longer in the era of paternalistic corporations, and that's up to each individual entity. And for us, as a services provider, to adapt to, I think, that definition from the corporation.
I'm curious, what do you guys do to make sure that your clients stay healthy? You have some clients, some flyers who could fly all over the world. They could fly 300 times in a year. How do you guys approach that challenge of just keeping people safe and happy?
I think the safe part is a question of notification. I'll come back to the happy part in a second. But I think the safe part is really a question of being on top of information that's relevant to the safety and well-being of travelers. So we're obviously, as a firm that's in this business, in the loop, well aware, and proactive in terms of that responsibility of disseminating that information. In fact, one of the tools that we've rolled out relatively recently is TravelWire, which essentially gives us, on a mobile platform with each of our corporate travelers, the ability to proactively message them, to reach out to them. So it's sort of having access to a travel counselor at the touch of a button on your phone. So that's in place, which is a really powerful capability for us to essentially understand where our travelers are and to reach out to them and message to them as needed. So there, I think it's a question of being proactive with the information. To the question of happy, I think for me there, it's fundamentally a question of really being phenomenal at servicing the customer's needs. And I think this discussion at Skift has certainly in part focused on personalization. I don't know of a better medium of personalization yet than a human being in the loop. And I think one of the things that we're terrifically proud of is the fact that not so much that we've got a resolutely Luddite view of the world that technology doesn't have a role, but to, I think, fully embrace what technology can do, but really at the end of the day, have the luxury, and I would underscore that word, of being able to have an experienced, capable, competent professional be able to help you with that travel. To put it into sort of personal anecdote terms, when I was at PR Newswire for 6.5 years, I'm obviously a seasoned, experienced traveler. And I know what I want to do. And I had this wonderful luxury of being able to rely on a person that I could pick up the phone to and figure out my travel, not just at the planning part, but obviously having that safety net when you're sitting at the airport 2 hours later when something doesn't work quite as well. So I think that's the happiness dimension to me.
There's been a lot of talk, we've written about on Skift, about the leisure traveler, half business, half leisure. It's all good. Are you seeing a trend of people sort of embracing that? They want to sort of combine a business trip with sort of the kind of leisure feel, that they're getting to know a community, that they're experiencing the destination?
Yeah, very much so, Andrew. And I think I sort of go back to that macro dimension of this, redefinition of workplace, work, the nature of work, employers, employee. Together with that whole blurring of that landscape, we're sort of moving to an era where we're working when we want to, or maybe all the time. We're communicating when we want to, or perhaps all the time. But along with that is this blurring between business and leisure. And I think it's really because we've got all these wonderful tools at our disposal to essentially do what we want to do when we want to do it. And some of that is reflected in the generations, obviously, that certainly are coming into the workforce, the Generation Y, the millennials, et cetera, in terms of their desire for redefinition of that time. But I think what certainly from my standpoint, I think is the case is very much oriented towards, I think, that redefinition of relationship that I think we touched on earlier. And so our business has really grown by word of mouth from both corporate accounts that have asked us to step in and help them on leisure travel, and equally on leisure, being able to say, actually, I'd like that same level of expertise, support, knowledge. Can you go ahead and handle this?
So how do you reach the younger generations who just want to dial something up?
Yeah.
If they're not talking to anyone, if they're tweeting or they're snapping or whatever?
You know, I came across this phenomenal statistic that I was very surprised about. One that sort of said, I think was a recent study, and I'll come back and find the reference, but that said 35% of OTA travelers would book offline if they could find a competent agent. The other part that was really surprising to me was actually looking at how the rate of adoption of traditional travel agents was higher for millennials right now.
Yeah.
So in some senses, I think people who are competent in terms of technology and the tools available to them also have that choice, and I think are looking at the use of a human in the loop at some stage or a competent travel counselor as that luxury that they're seeking. It's not that they don't know how to use the tools, they of course do, they're capable of it. It's just that they'd like to rely on somebody they can trust to essentially accomplish that. Some ways for me, this harkens back to sort of that burst of activity, you know, a number of years ago around financial services and trading. For a while, you could go out there, run your own portfolio, buy whatever you wanted to, very inexpensively, and it really felt as if that wave is behind us, and people, you know, it's a luxury in my mind to be able to rely on a competent financial professional, even though there are cheaper ways of doing it.
Yeah, for sure. You know, yesterday, Virtuoso's Matthew Upchurch spoke, talking about sort of his vision of service in luxury travel. But overall, a lot of people don't understand that there's so many travel agents out there, they're ready to serve you, and they're in your community. How do you get the word out? How do you get consumers to use agents and to understand the actual scope of travel agents in North America?
So one of the things, that's a great question, Andrew, and I think historically we've relied on word of mouth. And because that satisfaction level has been high enough, that's been a pretty good way of fueling the growth of our business, and I'm sure other businesses like us. But one of the technology initiatives we invested in heavily a number of years ago was really to create something called Agent Explorer. It has a number of other names it goes by. But if you go onto Google today and you put down whatever aspect of leisure travel you'd like, and it knows you obviously from a geocode perspective, or if you put in your zip code, it's going to likely pull up a travel leader's website that's going to point you to an experienced travel agent who knows that particular aspect of what you're looking for and is actually located somewhere close to your community. And this has been the source of, I think, approximately, I believe year to date since since the inception of the program, over 50,000 leads that we've routed to our agents. So we know there's a hunger we're tapping into in terms of our the consuming public and their desire to find experienced, competent travel agents. So.
All right, that makes sense. You know, finally, you just started. Do you have any big goals for Travel Leaders Group in 5 years? Do you want to see more travel agents out there? Do you want to see smarter travel agents out there, more tech savvy? What's the plan?
My view of what the landscape looks out there is I don't see the business as really an either or. So just to share with you an anecdote, like all of us, you know, I'm connected obviously to folks in the travel industry, and I had a call from somebody introducing me to a startup. I won't mention their name, but the startup was focused on how to make the whole process of ordering food in advance before you go on a flight much easier, right? And they had a unique solution to it, and gave them some advice, etc. But the real thought that was taking place in my head was an application like that eases, my trip to the airport, gets me something that either healthy or whatever that I'd like to eat before, and makes that efficient is a great thing. And actually, that's something an individual can do themselves, or a travel counselor or an agent can do. Right. So the world that I view ahead isn't an either-or of OTA versus traditional. It's really a hybrid world of saying, look, there are some experiences, if I think of my own personal life, where I'll clearly do the research and use the tools that are available to me. There are others, case in point, at a family level, we're headed off to Burma this Christmas. Absolutely wanted to rely on.
You don't want to deal with
I don't want to show up in Yangon wondering where my services are. So I think it's a world where we're using technology and competent advice and expertise to augment themselves in the right framework to make the experience great.
All right, excellent. Now we have time for Q&A. Anyone have any questions? I have more questions. No one else does? All right, well, let's see. We didn't really talk about trends in leisure travel.
Right.
Because I know that, let's see, I wrote it down. You guys, Travel Leaders Group agencies are about 30% of North American agencies.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
That's what your website says.
Yes.
It might not be true.
I'm in this wonderful position, I think, as we mentioned earlier, Andrew, of being 4 weeks in the role, so I'm actually happily ignorant about a lot of things about our business. That might be one of them. But that number sounds approximately right.
So you're coming in, people want experiential travel. People want to travel with their families. People want longer trips. How do you suss out what people actually want and convince them to travel in these ways? Do you build relationship with partners on the ground?
Yeah. So I think one of the benefits of having this wide array of 40,000 agents under this umbrella is that it represents, I think, a great deal of breadth of experience and depth of experience. I think the challenge is always exposing that breadth and depth to consumers and customers. And so while we talked about earlier, word of mouth has worked phenomenally well, tools like Agent Explorer are really starting to find ways in which we can intermediate ourselves into the way travelers shop. So I think, as you probably know, over 90% of all leisure travel searches start at Google. So if that's the place where the vast majority of travel is happening, at least our unique capabilities need to show up in that process. So I think together with that, and really thinking about my experience at PR Newswire, I think one of the things that probably we as an industry have still more to do is the creation of high quality content, particularly to aid in the planning part of the process. I think the travel industry is phenomenally good at that last mile of taking a set of constraints, date, location, and pumping out a transaction fantastically, efficiently, fast, reliably. But sort of at that 100,000-foot view level, I think we're all still struggling with what the set of tools are that help people, I think, determine what they want to do, where they want to go. And for me, the real key insight into all of that, and part of where I think the solution lies, is that's part of the experience, not just the traveling part. The whole planning part is part of the experience, and I think they're finding better ways to, I think, make sure that the experiences that all these speakers have talked about today really come alive.
Also, from the travel agency perspective, there's an experience in working with someone who's experienced, who's been to the destination, who can assure you that they know the best places to go, the right time of year to go. That if you're doing the researching and discovery yourself, you're at the mercy of all of these different sources.
Well said, Andrew. I mean, the analogy that I like to think about is really it feels as if there's nothing that's not possible online today with the tools that are available to us, right? So, for example, if I want to connect to anybody on the universe, LinkedIn's a pretty powerful vehicle to get introduced to anybody in this room or elsewhere. But there's a big difference between me linking to somebody LinkedIn directly and going via somebody like you who might be connected in Skift. There's just a very different value proposition. So now follow that analogy across to walking into a hotel as Andrew, who's booked it directly at the Corinthia in London, which is a lovely 5-star we do lots of business with, and showing up there as somebody who's been booked through Travel Leaders, which has a very different experience attached to it, might be something as simple as Wi-Fi and breakfast, or just the courtesy of the welcome, but I do think it's a valid analogy to sort of think back to say, there's actually a human part of this loop that's an important part.
For sure.
That frankly can be aided by technology, accelerated, but not necessarily replaced. Yeah. And there's, I think, just an essential something in the human contact part that's also very difficult to replicate.
And on that note, we're all out of town. Thank you so much.
Thank you, I appreciate it.